Biblical theology, we believe that our great enemy, our great oppressor is Satan. Oppressor does not have a skin color to it. Unfortunately, critical race theory believes that the great enemy is white people. When you believe all white people are oppressors, then all white people need to be punished then, which is extremely dangerous naturally.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About podcast. I'm here today with Samuel Say, blogger, Instagrammer. How would you describe yourself best?
Blogger is fine. And I don't know. I think that's probably how I describe myself, just blogging.
Yeah, I always like to let people describe themselves in their own words because I'm never sure. It's interesting to see the differences about how you perceive someone and how they kind of see their own title. So I kind of tend to let people do the talking. So if you want to talk a little bit to our listeners kind of about who you are and your background, because I'm familiar with your work from online, but just in case they haven't seen you before, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I'm Samuel Say. Most people who know of me might know me more as Slowtowrite. I blog at slowtowrite.com, and I'm on social media, sometimes causing some trouble, I suppose, a little bit, as Slow to Write, also across all social media platforms. I am primarily known for, I suppose, two things, which I guess would be two things you shouldn't talk about.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we love to talk about on this show.
Yeah. Two things being abortion. I work for a pro-life organization. I'm a pro-life advocate here in Canada. That's where I'm at too. I'm in Canada, where abortion is a major issue here. We are the only Western nation, actually, or really the only democratic nation in the entire world without a law on abortion. Abortion is completely legal.
Wow.
Throughout all stages of pregnancy here.
That's all across the country?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Many Canadians don't know that.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm known for that, but I'm also known for writing about racial issues and critical race theory and things like that.
Yeah. So this is something we've been seeing come up a lot recently. I think actually both issues we've been seeing more on abortion recently. I think I'm not sure if it's maybe just I'm noticing it more, but I feel like it's kind of come more to the forefront, especially in America and where I am, because in Northern Ireland we only just had abortion allowed in any circumstances just for the first time recently because our local government, I suppose, are trying to hold out and stop it for as long as possible. But I guess it became a UK-wide law, so it came into effect. So I think it's just been kind of something that's coming up all across the world, and especially the Western world at the minute. People are reevaluating, I guess, their historical views on this. But in terms of and that issue, how did you get involved maybe in being a pro-life advocate? When did that first become a big issue for you? Because I think a lot of people can coast and not really respond to the abortion issue.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, it started way back when I was 18, 19 years old, when one of my friends called me. At the time, I was not a Christian. I was not at any means educated on the pro-life issue. And a friend of mine called me saying, Sam, what would you say to a girl considering an abortion? Now, keep in mind that at the time, this is a friend of mine, and we would ask each other random questions all the time, just to figure out how we would answer that question. So when this person asked me that, I thought it was just a hypothetical question. I didn't know that it was I didn't know that question was the most pressing issue in her life. I didn't know she was pregnant.
Right.
So I just said, I don't know. And that was really it.
Mm-hmm.
But a year later, she confessed to me that just days after she asked me that question, she got an abortion. And as you can probably imagine, that had a pretty big impact on me.
Wow. Yeah.
I was like, man, so you're telling me what I said to you may have, if I had said the right things to you, it could have impacted, you, and it could have saved your child. So that was always on my mind for quite a bit. But then about, I guess, 10 years later, about 3 years ago, that's when a friend of mine told me about a pro-life organization here in Canada named CCBR. And there was an internship, a summer internship that they were making available. And I signed up, and I loved it because I wanted to, because for a long time, even though I had been reading my Bible and I knew theologically, how to defend the pro-life, the pro-life thinking with
Mm-hmm.
a pro-life position. I didn't know much else outside of that. I didn't know the human rights arguments. I didn't know the scientific arguments. I didn't know much about that. I knew the basic ones, but I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know how to use it in a way that I could call myself um, a pro-life advocate to be able to reach out to all kinds of people in changing their minds about abortion. So I joined that internship, and I before the internship, I made a goal that I wanted to change over 30 people's minds in abortion. Because one of the things we do at the internship is not only do we learn how to become pro-life advocates, but we also go to major areas across the GTA area, being the
Yeah.
Greater Toronto area, and we talk to different kinds of people, students, just any kind of stranger. And I made a goal that I wanted to change around 30 people's minds in abortion.
Mm.
But by the grace of God, I was able to change 75 people's
Wow.
minds. And, every single time I would do that, I would remember that one friend of mine from years
Mm.
before that I wasn't able to say anything to change her mind. So that's how I got involved. And now
Yeah.
I'm a community liaison at CCBR. And it's been, the pandemic has made it interesting because,
Yeah. I can imagine.
the
Yeah.
lockdown and everything else. But nevertheless, yeah, it's been a great time being able to, save preborn babies and help mothers
Mm.
keep their babies.
Yeah, I think there's a negative stereotype automatically around pro-life people, especially from people who are just not Christians or not educated in the issue. You think of people harassing people, kind of, or almost being abusive to them outside
Yeah.
abortion clinics, and these are the kind of stereotypes that come forward. You're not loving, you're kind of forcing your opinion on people in a mean way. That's the kind of stereotype. Have you found that you had to kind of battle that to change people's minds on the issue, or sometimes the arguments speak for themselves?
I think most of the time, or almost basically all the time, I think the arguments is speaking for itself.
Mm.
Primarily because what we do is we don't go to, um, abortion clinics or anything like that. Although I wouldn't call it a clinic because they're not healing people there. They're not hurt.
Right.
They're not helping people. They're killing people. I'll just call it an abortion center. Nevertheless, we can't. To the government here in Canada, they banned us. I'm forgetting exactly what the limit is, but we cannot be anywhere near close to
Mm.
an abortion clinic anyway. Nevertheless, when we are going out and doing our work, we have images of preborn babies. We
Mm.
have images of aborted preborn babies with us.
Right.
So when they see that right away, now we've done our research and we know that basically about 70% of people who see the images, they develop more negative feelings about abortion. They become more
Mm.
pro-life just by seeing that naturally, right? um, but because of that, when they see that, many of them, they understand why we're there. They know we're there to save preborn babies.
Mm.
Naturally, many will be upset, but that's not because of how we're doing it. They're upset mostly because they know what's happening in our country and in our world,
Mm.
and they also know they approve of it, and they
Mm.
also know they're approving of something as an injustice. And
Or almost denial in some cases, I'm sure.
exactly. So that's the pushback. But we don't. Also, let's face it. Oftentimes, people will see others abusing us. They will see people insulting us and even trying to attack us.
Hmm.
So when they see that, and we are being calm and just reaching out to them, with passion but calm, we don't see anybody really uh, believing that we are the ones who are being abusive
Mm.
towards them.
Yeah, I guess people might think, that kind of approach, it's almost a disturbing image to show someone, these kind of very graphic images. Some people might say that's a hateful act in some ways. How would you talk to someone who thinks what you're doing is it's causing distress to people, or in some way, a nasty thing to do? What would you say to them?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question because there are many times where we have to explain to people why we're doing this.
Mm.
Um, and well, one, there is the history. There's the historical aspect in that those images are disturbing. Look, I hate seeing those images. I don't like them at all.
Mm.
But I want to see them because they make me more pro-life. They make me. I see the human. That these are not
Right.
just, you know, ideas. These are people. 50 million babies every year across the world that are
Mm.
aborted. So when we see the images, it helps us to know what we're fighting for. Now that's from my side.
Yeah.
Now for the people who are seeing the images from the outside, well, throughout history, as we'll talk about race,
Yeah.
later on. There's Emmett Till. I don't know if you know who Emmett Till is, but Emmett Till was a black boy in the U.S. who was killed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he was lynched, and that became the catalyst for the civil rights movement because his mom made sure that at his funeral there would be an open casket because he was
Mm.
so brutally beaten up.
Wow.
She said, I want the whole world to see essentially what Jim Crow has done to my boy. And
Mm.
when that happened, it permeated across the entire world. That image to this day is one of the most famous or infamous images from the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
When you mention Emmett Till, everyone remembers that picture.
Mm.
So I think even, for example, there's a rapper, I won't mention his name, but there's a rapper who got himself in trouble because he used Emmett Till's the image of Emmett Till in a very um, unhelpful manner, to put it to just
Yeah.
I'll just say that. But
Mm-hmm.
people got upset with him because that image is still in people's minds.
Yeah.
So, and then you have also slavery, where there is the Brooks ship as well too, and that had a major impact too on the abolitionists and how they're able to change people's minds, because that ship made people understand the image of the ship anyways, how
Mm-hmm.
brutal slavery was. So these images are difficult, but they help people understand and have a greater image as to what's really happening with preborn babies. And outside of that too, I want to do everything I possibly can to save a baby.
Mm-hmm.
And now obviously, we want to do so in a way that's honoring to God and loving to people. But if I can show people, if I can convince someone that,
Mm-hmm.
that through this image, right? If I could convince them that abortion is wrong, that abortion is murder, it's an injustice, then I absolutely need to do it. That's not the only thing we do. We use human rights arguments. We'll talk about a number of different things to
Mm-hmm.
make them, through reason, through logic, and through theology, to help them become more pro-life, to help them save or keep their babies. But those images, the reason why we use them is because they are effective, and also because it leads people to understand the humanity of the
Mm.
preborn baby.
Yeah, I don't know if this image made its way across the Atlantic to the Americas, but I it reminds me of a case where um there's been a lot of like refugees kind of fleeing from Syria, over and it's the image of the child washing up on the shore. If you're familiar with
Yeah.
that image, that
Before
was
you even, sorry, go ahead.
no, I
Sorry.
was just gonna say that was a huge catalyst, I think, in the wet
Yes.
in Europe really for
Yeah.
the realities of what's going on.
Before you even finish the sentence, I knew exactly what you're referring to, and that's the power of the image, right?
Mm,
That
exactly.
that and it was that image that led, especially Canada, to become more active in bringing in refugees into our nation.
Mm,
So whatever you think about that whole crisis,
yeah,
nevertheless, that image
yeah,
was
is
a
what you remember.
major catalyst in in bringing many refugees, or bringing the Syrian war crisis into the
Hmm.
forefront of people's minds.
Yeah, we've naturally brought up refugees and immigration, and another thing that people say when they talk about pro-lifers is that you're pro-life when it's in the womb, and then when when it gets to the real world, you're anti-refugee or anti-immigrant and these kind of things. To me, in some ways, I can see an element of truth in some people who maybe prioritize one over another, possibly. But how would you respond then if someone made that argument to you? That you're pro-life, or Christians maybe are pro-life up until someone's born.
Yeah, that's a great question, and to be honest with you, something that really disturbs me quite a bit, um, because if you if you we want justice for all people. We don't. If you're pro-life, it means that you believe that murder is wrong,
Mm.
essentially. That you are anti-murder. You're pro-life. Nevertheless, there's a big difference between. No, okay. Before I even mention that,
Yeah.
I don't think any pro-life person is necessarily against refugees or against immigration. Now I'm an immigrant to Canada, so naturally I'm pro-immigration,
Right.
but I've never met anybody who some would describe as being anti-refugees or anti-immigration as really being anti-immigration or
Right.
refugees. What what they might say is, well, we just want a small number. So, for example,
Mm.
just right now, the world's dealing with a heavy, just bad economy right now.
Mm-hmm.
Canada right now is our economy is not doing great right now, and it's going to get worse naturally as this thing develops.
Mm-hmm.
I personally, right now, would say I wouldn't want our nation bringing in lots of immigrants right now, just because right now this is a really bad economy, and if we don't take care of our citizens here, how can we take care of people?
Right.
It's just not the right. Now,
Mm.
does that mean that I'm anti-immigration? Of course not. I'm just saying that right now that shouldn't be our priority.
Mm.
Um, with that being said, if you are pro-life, again, I was saying before, it means that you are anti-murder.
Right.
Now, abortion is legal. It's legal to kill preborn babies. It's not legal to kill immigrants, right?
Yeah.
Or even illegal immigrants. That is I'm
A
forgetting my word here.
fallacy. Yeah.
Yeah,
Kind of like
it's a
putting it some.
fallacy. I'm trying to figure out the opposite of that. That's the analogous to the pro-life issue, right? It's about murder. So if I was saying it's okay to kill immigrants,
Yeah.
which would be odd because I'm an immigrant, but whatever.
Right.
If I was saying it was okay to kill immigrants, but it's not okay to kill preborn babies, then I would say, well, then I'm a hypocrite. But the two are not the same. So
Mm.
it is a fallacy, right? And it's
Right.
true for any kind of issue, even like with healthcare, for example. The idea is that if you don't believe in, essentially, they say free healthcare, but it's not free. If you don't believe in a socialist healthcare, now I know you and I are in nations where we have that.
Yeah.
In America, in America they don't. But to be frank, just to be honest, I personally do not like that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
for many reasons, but nevertheless, the two are not quite the same. Because no one here believes that no one should have health care.
Mm-hmm.
The point is who should pay for it,
Right.
right? And how do we go about that? That's not quite the same, right? Again, so to compare the two, to compare someone not being able to afford perhaps the best healthcare
Mm-hmm.
to a preborn baby being murdered is quite
Mm.
a different level. Because one is about what's the most efficient, and the other one is, well, what's justice. Um,
Yeah.
so I would say that we have to remember the key point here about abortion. It's is that abortion is legal. It's legal to kill preborn babies. It's not legal to kill people who cannot afford healthcare, and it's not legal to kill immigrants. That's the issue.
Yeah, I guess the argument people tend to bring up then is they say through negligence, you're murdering people almost, or through not paying for their healthcare or not allowing them over the Mexican US border, not supporting those things, that you're somehow, being negligent to the end that you're and that's ending up with them dying and things like that. So I'm not sure if that's, to me, it's somewhat over dramatized, if that's the correct word. I think sometimes people kind of, it's a way, it's designed to kind of put the impetus on someone else to have action, where really there's a lot of factors at play, that most of which involve the person in that situation's own
Yeah.
choice. So
Yeah.
it's a very tricky, I mean, it's hard to combat that kind of a line, I think, sometimes, because
Yeah.
it just, I think it just often comes across like you don't care when you try
Yeah.
to think logically. And I guess your work, it's, you do a lot of work along those lines, where it's quite, it makes sense, it's logical, it's well thought through, and I agree with most things you write. So is it's coming back to this perception thing. Do you think sometimes it's hard to shake the perception that you don't care, when really what you're trying to do is think logically about the situation and what helps and what's
Yeah.
not helpful and what's just?
Yeah. Yeah. I never want to defend my motives because that's the other person's sin, not mine. If people assume that a simple logical argument means that the person doesn't care, then that's their immorality, not mine. So I wouldn't want to defend my. Now, don't get me wrong. You want to show people that you care, but out of love for them, not out of defending yourself.
Right.
So I think in my writing, at least I hope I care for people, and I
Mm-hmm.
hope that when I'm writing for people, I'm showing that I care for people. Um, you know, uh, and again, it would be odd, right? Because many of the things that I write about, so for say an example here, I'm against illegal immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Now some might think, well, that in of itself is showing a lack of care, which would be again weird because I have relatives who have pursued illegal immigration, and I have relatives. And again, I'm an immigrant, illegal immigrant, but I'm still an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it would be odd that I would be accused of that. Nevertheless, just
Mm.
because of my position, some might feel that way. Also, I grew up in extreme poverty in Ghana, and I grew up in poverty here too in Canada. I was raised in the welfare system and everything else. I a, a lot of the social justice points, I was definitely in that environment. I
Mm.
was in there. Um, so when I write about these things, I'm writing about it because I do care. And I know why I was in that position. I know one of the reasons why my family and I were poor.
Mm.
Um, and I write about that passionately and hopefully using theology and logic and facts because that's important. We live in a world today where we are more focused on our narratives and in lived experiences, although no one wants to care about my lived experiences.
Mm.
Nevertheless, we place those things on a higher level than facts. But no, our God is an objective, truthful God. He is the truth.
Mm.
And so anyway, I wouldn't, so I don't really want to defend myself on those things. I just would say, you can't read my heart. And oftentimes it's just really people just wanting to ignore the facts,
Mm.
and they know they can't win that way. So they want to try and attack the person by saying that you don't really care. Now, again, I understand that it can come across that way. And there are, I'm sure, people who agree with me who don't care. I'm sure there are. Nevertheless, I think we're all better off if we just focus on what is being said instead of
The
assuming.
motivations.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that's what people who tend to disagree with me tend to do.
Mm. Yeah, well, I guess the old saying is even a broken clock is right twice a day. So even if they think that you're wrong about a lot of things, they can at least look at the argument you're making and think, do they agree or do they not agree? And you
Yeah.
mentioned that obviously, you've lived through a lot of these experiences. You blog about topics and from perspectives that um I guess I guess it's fair to say that the conclusions you come to and the arguments you make are often not typical of someone who has gone through those kind of experiences. For example, I think it's important to hear perspectives on race coming from the lived experience of an immigrant, a black person living in the Americas that maybe doesn't conform to exactly what everyone else is saying. I think that's
Mm.
interesting to hear those things, and even your perspectives on immigration. Some people might think that that's not typical of someone of your race or experience or whatever. So, what is it, do you think, in you that sought to see something different to what the narrative was, if you know what I
Mm.
mean? Why
Yeah.
did you almost come out thinking differently to a lot of people, a lot of your peers and people in similar situations?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think one, it might surprise you, but the majority of immigrants are actually against illegal immigration. It's not often reported and it's not often
Mm.
said, but that's across all in Canada and in the U.S. Every poll, every research shows that illegal immigrants are against illegal immigration.
Mm.
So I'm not in the minority there. Nevertheless, I know that as a Black person, um, especially with my history with poverty and everything else, I know I'm in the minority. I think I'm less in a minority than people might think. Nevertheless,
Mm.
that is definitely the case. So why? That's a good question. I think a major part of that is um, I've always been very inquisitive. I've always wanted to understand things,
Mm.
and I've always wanted to understand why things are the way they are. Uh, my mom tells me that I was extremely annoying when I was a kid. I was always asking why. You should answer a question. I'm like, okay, but why? I was always like that. I
Mm,
never wanted to accept the status quo. I always
right.
wanted to investigate, and I think that's part of it. I think um, by always wanting to understand why things the way they are, it probably led me to conclusions that I think many people who were in my position before just never pursued.
Mm,
Um, and I think now, and I think for the people who do pursue um, those questions as well, but don't agree with me, honestly, I think it just comes down to theology. I think that's just what it comes down to. At the risk of sounding like I don't care, um, I think by the grace of God, with the influences in my life and the ministries that have had a deep impact on me,
hmm
I've always wanted to test everything with scripture. And I've always wanted to let scripture shape my mind on every issue. And there've been many times when I didn't want to accept certain things that I
hmm
knew to be true, but I did, and I knew I had to because of how I have been taught to always never trust my feelings and
Right. Mm,
my own subjective desires, but just to go
yeah.
straight to the Word of God. And I think that's a major reason why.
Mm,
Because I'm a regular guy like everybody else, but if I'm swimming up against the stream, it's really because of what I've learned from people, some of my heroes like John MacArthur or Paul Washer, um, Vadi Bokum,
hmm
um, you know, uh, people like that were it's essentially discipled me from afar. So I've always, I think, been disposed to pursue the scriptures above all things. That's what I learned from these
mm.
guys.
Yeah,
So
and do you think there's a difference sometimes between how people, like, when I think of some of these issues, people tend to say things like maybe that's not very Christian of you, or what would Jesus do, or those kind of things, but maybe not necessarily back it up with scriptural insight. So do you think
yeah,
there's a difference between what people's perceptions are, even Christians, what their perceptions are of how they should act and what they should do in a certain situation? Is there a difference between that and actually what the scripture can say in some situations? Because I think some people tend to go off, I guess, the idea of what they believe the gist of Christianity is.
yeah,
Jesus would act in this manner according to what I know of him, so I'm going to go by this. Whereas,
mhm,
I've found out sometimes things in scripture can be very challenging because they're not exactly what you would expect to read there. So, do you think there's sometimes some people tend to pursue their idea of what Christianity should be rather than the scriptural idea of what it is?
absolutely. And that's because and again, a lot of research shows this that we don't read the Bible a lot. So when you're not reading the Bible a lot, and all you're hearing is the news, and the news is telling you one narrative,
Yep.
you become vulnerable to what they're telling you because you don't have the biblical and theological basis to reject that, so you embrace it. And also, we Christians, we have a natural desire, not we want to help, we love people,
Mm,
and we want to just stand beside the oppressed. That's what Christianity, that's what we're about. We are to we are to be like our God, like our Jesus, um who stands with the outcast. The problem is the culture is the culture has a different view of what an outcast is, and it has a different view of what justice is.
mm,
It says it declares good as evil and evil as good, and Satan is cunning. He knows how to deceive, and our culture is a very deceptive culture. And I think a lot of Christians, when they think what they're following is Christianity, but it isn't, they're doing that because they're not reading their Bibles oftentimes. And when they are reading it, again, they're not pursuing what it says to the issues today. So just give an example. Even when it comes to something as simple as George Floyd, what happened with
yep.
George Floyd, whenever I ask people this question, it seems to be the first time they're really thinking it through. And this is like the Christians, because I spoke at a Christian school recently. I just asked them a basic question: why do you believe George Floyd was killed because of racism? Why?
hmm
They really couldn't answer that. They couldn't. And I said, you're saying that. Now again, George Floyd it was a horrible, horrible, brutal
Yeah.
thing.
And that's one thing everyone pretty agrees on, no matter what you believe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. But there seems to be that we think that Black people can't be killed by cops simply because of police brutality or bad policing. They
Mm.
seem to think that every time a Black person is killed by a white cop, it has to be because of racism. So when I ask them, well, why do you believe that? What is it? Besides the fact that it was police brutality, why? They couldn't answer it. Then they said, well, remember, as a Christian, you cannot do that. The Bible's very clear. You cannot assume the worst of people. You cannot assume that even for a murderer, even for police brutality, you cannot assume you know their hearts. You can't do that. You simply have to be humble and say, we don't know. And that's my position. I'm not
Mm.
saying I'm just saying I don't know. And just by saying that, it's controversial, I suppose.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, but and I think that's just it, right? Just remembering what the Bible says, that love hopes all things. So even for a Derek Chauvin, I have to believe that love hopes all things, and saying I don't know. If I don't see any evidence, and if he himself has not said that he killed him because of racism, then I cannot believe that. And anyway,
Mm.
so that's one very basic
Yeah.
example as
I
to
guess
how.
I was going to say, I
Go ahead.
guess it comes back to the turning the other cheek idea, where it's counterintuitive to almost let someone, like, it's almost better to be too forgiving almost, and too cautious to think ill of someone, than it is to condemn them without knowing.
Yeah,
That's, I guess, the struggle for a lot of people, and for myself included, that you turning the other cheek often means that you may in some ways be proven wrong, or you may they may take advantage of you. But that's the posture you should take, of being willing almost to be taken advantage of for the sake of being loving. And I
yeah.
guess that's what you're saying reminds me of in this scenario, which I hadn't necessarily thought of before. I hadn't connected those all together. But
Mhm.
I agree. Obviously, we don't know what the motives were in the George Floyd case, but are you familiar with the Just Thinking podcast? I'm sure
Yes, of
but
course. Yeah,
yeah, they did a great episode on the Breonna Taylor saga, which is kind of like, I think that's one of the most egregious examples of misrepresentation and almost
yep.
trying to associate things. And I guess the was it Jacob Blake as well, was another case which
Mhm.
people
Mhm.
were very quick to jump on the bandwagon of
Yeah,
assuming motives that were later. I mean, it's
yeah,
fair to say they were proven to be wrong, even if the
yeah,
public perception doesn't believe that.
yeah.
Um, do you find it uncomfortable to talk about these topics in front of people? Being people, I think people from a white person's perspective, they almost assume that Black people should act a certain way or talk a certain way. Do you
Yeah.
find it uncomfortable to go against perceptions and talk about these issues in an honest way, in your opinion?
No, honestly, I kind of love it. I kind of love it. Uh, I kind of love shocking people with that. I mean, I don't. Don't get me wrong. I don't love being controversial by any means. I don't. But I just know two things. A lot of white people who would agree with me, oftentimes they're just afraid to share their
Right.
thoughts. So when I tell them my view, I can just feel just the sigh
Yeah.
of relief that they're like, oh, okay, all right.
Mm.
Then there's also the other group who assume I'm going to agree with them on, again, this is like the people who believe, the narrative.
Yeah.
These are the white people who believe the narrative. They will oftentimes just want to, you know, signal their virtue to me. And then when they're going on and on, you're just talking about how they love Black people and so and so and so, all that. And then I shock them by saying,
Mm.
yeah, you're wrong. I
Right.
kind of like that a little bit, because then they sometimes they realize their folly,
Mm.
and anyway, so
Well, it breaks a stereotype in some ways. That is
yeah,
truly what
exactly.
breaking
Yeah,
generalization of stereotype is
yeah,
about. You can't assume that someone of a certain race thinks a certain way.
exactly,
That
exactly.
is racism.
Exactly. And the reason why I enjoy it too sometimes is because, again, a lot of the white people who are, pro Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
Um, if I was white and I was making those same arguments that I'm making now, they would say I'm a racist.
Yeah.
Now, right now, they'll still say that I'm internalizing racism. They would
Right.
insult me, racial, but nevertheless, most white people aren't brave enough to do that,
Mm.
to insult me in that manner. Nevertheless, because of that, I enjoy telling them, no, I actually don't agree with you. And then just
Mm.
because of their views, they're unwilling to, to debate me for the most part, because, well, they might think then is that their white fragility, right? Because I'm black and they're white, and that whole concept is,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So because of that, I enjoy disagreeing with them because I know because of their views, they're uncomfortable. And again, I don't want to make people uncomfortable, but
Mm.
I want them to try to remember, look, here you are now being afraid to disagree with me now. But if I was white, you would be probably shaming me, as,
Mm.
a racist. And that's what I enjoy about it. But no, but I'm not uncomfortable at all,
Yeah.
with these issues.
Well, I totally get what you're saying in terms of, I think I felt that in my life in terms of, I would never, I don't think I would feel comfortable contradicting a black person talking about Black Lives Matter, because I feel
Yeah.
like, I guess the narrative being pushed is that you have to kind of defer to people's experiences, their lived
Yeah.
experiences, like you mentioned before, and that it would be wrong to kind of to tell someone that they haven't experienced things that they say they have, or that they haven't seen things that they have, because
Mhm.
I guess they'll relate to their own experiences of racism in their lives and say and think,
Mhm.
well, maybe you're denying that as well. So it's, I think I relate to what you're saying in terms of the walking on eggshells a little bit and talking about these topics, because you don't
Mhm.
want to come across as racist. That's, I think, these days it's one of the biggest fears, I guess, of any white person, is to be labeled and shamed publicly as being a
Yes.
racist. You get that thrown at you, and it's very hard to shake that. So
Yeah.
people tend to maybe not discuss these topics or seek the truth on these matters because of how the perception it might come across. But would you say then that would you encourage people to persist in seeking after the truth, regardless of how it may come across? Like, for example, me as a white person, would you say I should continue to pursue the truth on these kind of charged issues, even if it means people might throw out these insults?
Absolutely. Obviously you want to do all, and I know you're a wise person, but obviously you do all these things with wisdom, and with patience, and with gentleness, and with meekness, and everything, and with respect. But yes, absolutely. The more white people refuse to share their voices in these issues, the more they are legitimizing the idea that white people shouldn't say anything about it. Um, so absolutely they should,
Mm.
because these issues are human issues. It's very, very dangerous to say that certain people shouldn't have a voice. It's extremely dangerous. It's not helpful at all. So absolutely, especially Christians, we have the truth. The world does not have the truth at all.
Mm.
We have the truth. The truth is not based on our skin color. It's based on our Bible. So whether you're black, white, in between, whatever, if your lived experiences are helpful in
Mm-hmm.
giving you a context but doesn't give you the truth.
Right,
So
right,
you
yeah.
have the Bible, you have, in a sense, I would say that, I mean, God's lived experience, and that is the authority.
Mm.
So you can say and repeat what the Bible says, and you will always be 100% right.
Mm.
Doesn't matter. If you repeat the Bible, you are right. So absolutely, the world is dying. The world is, is hurting, and needs truth. So anybody at all, who has the truth should be speaking out, and we Christians do.
Mm. What has your experience of racism been like in your own life? Is that something you've encountered often?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I remember my first 10 years were in Ghana, where 99.9% of the
Right.
population is black. So, so I definitely had experienced some forms of ethnic prejudice in Ghana, between different tribes,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't, uh, skin color based, right?
Right.
But when I came to Canada right away, yeah, I was being called the N word and everything, and I had no idea what
Mm.
that even meant initially
Right.
because, I'm like, well, what's going on here? Um, but yeah, I've experienced it. I experienced it in high school in very horrible ways.
Mm.
I've experienced it since I've had it since then, as well too. Even sometimes as I'm doing pro-life advocacy, people will yell the N word.
Wow. Wow,
To
that's
me. Yeah,
crazy.
yeah. So, um, I've had it in many ways. Nevertheless, you might be surprised to hear that I've had it worse now that I've been blogging against Black Lives Matter and critical race theory, but from the other side,
Mm.
from Black people or white people who do not agree with me on these issues. They label me an Uncle Tom, an Uncle
Mm.
Ruckus, a coon, um, Oreo, and all those kind of things. A lot.
I, I haven't heard that one before. I assume it's white on the inside kind of thing. Is that what that's
Exactly.
referring to?
Exactly.
Mm.
And oftentimes it's coming from prominent evangelicals, believe it or not, who are embracing critical race theory. And that hurts me much more because I've said this before that if someone calls me, I don't know how you work me saying the N word in, full. I don't know how I don't know
I
how
mean,
many might be awkward,
that's
might be awkward for you,
yeah.
but
It's not going to be totally awkward for me, I guess. In terms of, obviously, if you're not offended, then why should I be? But
no,
yeah,
I'm not offended by that. But when someone calls me a nigger, all that really means is I hate you because you're black.
right.
That's what they're really saying. But when someone calls me an Uncle Tom or something like that, they're saying, I hate your character, especially because you're black.
Mm.
Because they're saying is that I'm betraying black people. They're saying that I am a traitor to my, what they
Yeah.
consider my own race as a way to try to receive favor from white people.
Mm.
So you're really because now, if I was a white person, that wouldn't offend them. They'll just say, "Well, you're white, you're just a racist." But because I'm black, they hate that I'm a black person who they believe has very poor character in betraying, you
Mm.
know, black people. Now, never mind you, everyone close to me, for the most part, except for my girlfriend, is black, right?
Mm.
Now, of course, I have many white friends too, but the closest people to me, my family, my mom, my siblings, they're black. Nevertheless, they're saying that I'm betraying my family,
Mm.
betraying the people who have shaped my life the most to curry favor to some, phantom
Right.
unknown entity out there.
Yeah,
Um,
it's when you think about it, it's quite a scathing remark because you're calling someone the N word, like you said. I guess that it's almost easy to deal with that as a shallow insult because you look at someone, you look at their image. It's like saying someone like mocking them for having a big nose
yeah,
or something. It's
yeah,
looking visually and then throwing something out based on what you've seen. Whereas
yeah,
what you're saying is they're actually attacking you, the person,
exactly.
beyond what they're just seeing with their eyes. That's
Yeah,
an insult to
exactly.
your character, to who you are, to
Exactly.
everything about you. So,
Exactly.
in many ways, I mean, I would never seek to minimize racial slurs, but that
Of
seems
course.
like almost a worse one to receive for you in some ways, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is much, much more painful. And trust me, like I said before, I had a very bad experience in high school
Mm.
with racism. This is much more painful because, again, it's, as you said, so eloquently, it is them attacking who I am, not just what I look like.
Yeah.
Right. Um, and, when you're younger, you know, the, someone attacking you for your appearance, it hurts you as it can hurt you too when you're older. Right. But as you get older and you understand more about life, who you are as a person, when that's attacked, that
Hmm.
wounds you much more.
Yeah.
Um, and especially because it's often coming from black people who claim I'm supposed to have some kind of a shared allegiance with them who are attacking me in this manner. It hurts all the more,
Mm.
especially when it's coming from people that I once considered friends too.
Yeah.
Say this too, because I've had, again, unfortunately, some people that I considered good friends before who would say this, and they know me, they know that's not true, but they say that oftentimes because they just want to hurt me as well too,
Mm.
and they do they manage to do that when they call me that. Now, again, over time, unfortunately, I've come to expect it, but um, yes, so when it comes to racism, absolutely, I've experienced that, and it's at its worst when it's being labeled
Mm.
those kind of racial slurs.
Mm. And um, when you look at how the world views these racial issues and people, even black people, how they deal with it, um, how do you feel when you see the general support of ideologies like Black Lives Matter and critical race theory? To you, does it feel almost sad that you're seeing people working against what you would say is their best interests in some ways? How do you feel looking in on that, especially in America, I guess?
Yeah, no, yeah, it saddens me because so after the civil rights movement in 19 in the mid 1960s, you had LBJ,
Mm-hmm.
Lyndon B. Johnson in the US, who introduced the Great Society and the War on Poverty, and that actually hurt the civil rights movement. Um, it set it's still setting Black Americans back, um, you know, well behind a lot of other Americans. And I mentioned that to say that the whole idea then was to have some form of reparations for Black people through the Great Society and the War on Poverty, but it's just been a disaster. In a similar way, what's happening through Black Lives Matter is destructive. It's probably going to be worse if it continues this way. Not probably, it will be worse
Mm.
than the Great Society. I'm not sure. Basically, just people who may not be aware, just to make it simple, during the civil rights movement, Black people were especially even before that, but especially through that, Black people were really doing well economically. Now, we want to be very clear. Of course, they were being oppressed, but in terms of progress, they were progressing very well, and it was seeming like at some point they would be able to not only believe in equality of outcome, but because they were being oppressed and seeing how they were progressing, it was encouraging to see.
Mm-hmm.
At least by looking, obviously I didn't live in that time, but looking back now, it was encouraging to see, or it is encouraging to see that
Mm-hmm.
they were, progressing well and would have eventually been on a similar economic path with some of their white American
Mm-hmm.
counterparts. But right after the Great Society and the War on Poverty, you see a huge change where instead of progress, you see regress.
Right.
Um, so it didn't help anything at all. It made things worse.
Mm.
And what I'm seeing now with Black Lives Matter is the same issue that it's going to hurt Black people. It's not helping Black people at all. In fact, at a very basic level, the riots that were happening last summer,
Mm-hmm.
who was it affecting? Black people, right? Black restaurant owners, Black
Mm-hmm.
business owners, right? That's at a very basic level, and nobody cared. Well, of course, many people cared, but the media and Black Lives Matter, they didn't care, right? So it's odd in that the pursuit of justice for Black Lives Matter is creating injustices and
Mm-hmm.
major problems for Black Americans. And even when it comes to crime has gone way up as well too, which is mostly, of course, also affecting Black people, right? So, and of course, you also have fatherlessness, which to me is a very personal thing. I grew up without a father.
Mm.
That's why I grew up in poverty. That's why, we were raised. I was raised in a shelter for a time. Because I did not have a father nor a father figure. And that is a major problem for Black Canadians, for Black Britons, and for Black Americans especially. And that's not being addressed. Instead, they're pursuing ideas and political agendas that will only further harm Black people in these areas.
Mm. And before we get on to some of the, I guess, the ideologies and talking about Black Lives Matter and critical race theory, you were talking about obviously how economically how Black Americans especially have kind of regressed. I was wondering if you think there's I guess, a spiritual element to that in terms of it seems like there's an oppression or like a ceiling on ambition, and I see it because the reason I recognize this is because in where I'm in Northern Ireland, it's not this exact same circumstance. Obviously, it's very white, but we've had huge conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and unionists in terms of people that want to stay as part of the United Kingdom and people that want to be part of United Ireland. And I've noticed, I noticed in my own community and even in the opposite community, a lot of times the reasons why we see a lot of maybe violence and conflict is because people feel like, I guess, something is almost imposed on them where they have a ceiling to their ambition. In terms of, I noticed that some people,
Yeah.
they settle into this pattern of generational, I guess you could say, poverty or being lower in the class system. And when you try to break out of that, you're almost pulled back in because they think you're trying to be better than them almost.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've noticed some parallels talking, or listening to people, Black Americans talking about a similar thing of like almost like a weight of keeping them down. And I just, it's almost like a
Yeah.
heaviness. And I was wondering if you thought there was maybe a spiritual aspect to that, something
Hmm.
that's maybe being pushed by the enemy to keep people down from breaking through,
Hmm.
and I
Yeah.
guess working towards this equality.
Absolutely. I think any any injustice, any political exploitation or oppression is caused by Satan. Um, so while I wouldn't say that Black people are oppressed today, I would say that they are we are exploited.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's true in Canada and that's true in America. The welfare system or exploits Black people in that it promises prosperity through the welfare system, but of course it doesn't. Or it promises safety through the welfare system, but it
Yeah.
doesn't at all. It makes things worse. I grew up in the welfare system, and I know it's not right. So my mom, for example, um, she is a very hardworking person, and for a time we needed it. Now again, the whole idea of the system is that it's supposed to just help you get back on your feet. It's
Right.
not supposed to be permanent, and she understood that when we came out of the shelter. We got into the system, and we were living in a government housing and everything else. And she was looking for a job, and she got a job. And then she went to the I guess I don't know what to call them, but she reached out to the welfare people and said, "Hey,
Mm-hmm.
I have a job now. It'll be hard, but we can take care of ourselves."
Right.
They said, "Oh, no, you should like stay on for a while still. Like, don't leave yet." She's like, "Wait a
Mm-hmm.
minute, but I have my hands, I have my feet. I can work. I can even work two jobs," which she ended up doing.
Right.
Um, to take care of. I don't want to be dependent on you guys. I want to teach my kids to be independent, and they were pressing her
Mm-hmm.
to not do
Wow.
that.
Mm.
That's a very basic example of that, right? Now, eventually, she had to force them to say, "No, leave me alone. I
Wow.
don't want your money." All right, and they finally said, "Okay, fine. We won't give you money." But
That's
all of
crazy.
her friends and all of her peers didn't do that,
Hmm.
and to this day, they're still in the system.
Yeah.
Mind you, my mom now was able to buy a house about 10 years after that. They're still there. That's not to shame them at all. I love them. I grew up with. Again, I love them.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a difference in mentality. My mom understands that if you don't work, you don't eat. And there is a consequence to this. So, absolutely, the welfare system creates a mentality that will compel people to become dependent on the government and not on God. And they won't pursue hard work and they won't pursue providing for their
Mm.
families. The government does not exist to provide for you. It's not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be um, a it's supposed to punish evil and reward good. That's what it's supposed to do. It's not supposed to be our fathers or our mothers. And unfortunately, every time I hear a politician saying that, I want to take care, I want to help,
Mm.
I always get nervous because no, that's not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to just protect us from injustices.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think my heart just breaks when I see almost a cycle of it's not even, I guess you could sort of frame it as despair or lack of ambition, but it's almost, what do we even do with our lives? Where do we go? What is there for us other than, and it's the same here obviously with Northern Irish kind of gangs, but it's kind of, you get involved in a cycle of, it's what you know and it's what people
Yeah,
around you do, and it's like
yeah,
getting sucked into a culture, and that's my heart
yeah,
breaks, whether it's, they're very different scenarios, but Black
yeah,
Americans or white Americans for that matter, or people in Northern Ireland getting involved in
yeah.
paramilitary organizations. I just, it's obviously, it's more than just, you can't just say it's people's ambition, but it's something
Mhm.
that's trying to, I guess, hold them down. And yeah, that
Yeah,
was, I guess, it must be spiritual in that regard, that it's something being fed to people to keep them
mhm,
down, and
mhm.
from reaching the heights and serving God, like you said, that's what, I guess, ultimately it's a godly life will result in you starting to act differently and move in different ways, and
Mhm.
think, like, like your mother, you said,
Yeah.
hard work ethic, those kind of things result from that. So
Mhm.
I guess for me, I had to conclude that there must be a spiritual aspect to that.
Oh, for sure.
And that one of the buzzwords of the minute really is this critical race theory thing. And a lot of people might not know much about it. They might have heard something about it.
Yeah.
Do you want to? Can we start with like I guess your understanding of what that means and a definition almost before we
Yeah.
talk about it?
Yeah, I don't blame people for not knowing what it is or being confused by it. It's a very complex ideology. And oftentimes, at a very basic level, myself and many others will explain it as this. It's basically the concept of, if people are familiar with more sociology, maybe basically it's the idea there's a conflict theory, that society is made up of people who are in conflict with each other. And it's been that way since the beginning of the time. And that's borrowed from a Marxist thinking. So Marx was one who developed the conflict theory. And it's the idea that in the past, they'll say that you had the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the oppressor and the oppressed, the privileged versus the underprivileged. So it could be, initially it was, again, strictly just economical. But now it's more cultural, where it is between men and women. Again, men being the oppressor, women being the oppressed,
Right.
white people and black people, immigrants versus citizen, cisgender versus transgender, um, Christian versus Muslim. And there is a Christian privilege that people need to be aware of. I think it will shape, I think in the future, it will become more prominent if we continue with this critical race theory rhetoric, or, just embracing it more, we'll get there. But anyway, that's at a very basic level what it is. More than that, though, critical race theory particularly is focused on Black people, right? So there's critical theory, which is which it deals with all the other kinds of oppressor versus the oppressed thinking. Critical race theory, though, is very particular in saying that Black people are oppressed in the whole world, but especially in the Western culture, in that Western society was built by white people, or white men particularly, for white men. Um, Therefore, it will never, ever change. So, especially legally, what we believe to be because right now, so what we would call liberal democracy, or which is not so much the ideology. I don't mean
Yeah.
leftism. I just
Yeah.
mean democracy, right? So
Yeah.
Canada, America, Britain, you have this, you have equality of you have equality of law, that we are all equal under the law. They would say that that sounds great, but that's colorblind ideology, in that in of itself is racist. And because it was shaped that way and is framed that way to make Black people believe.
Yeah, like it's ignorant of circumstances and history and all that stuff.
Exactly, right? But this system is based on individualism that from the very beginning has helped white people and oppressed Black people. And that would never change unless we abolish the system completely, to have an anti-racist system, which really is a more race conscious socialism, essentially, is what it comes down to, where you then produce equality of outcome. Right. So the whole goal here is to produce equality of outcome for Black people. And perhaps even in many cases, to have Black people being wealthier or being more privileged than white people. But that's generally what critical race theory is. And they will oftentimes push that agenda through what we call standpoint epistemology, or legal storytelling, which basically means that, as we mentioned earlier about lived experiences, that Black people, when it comes to understanding oppression and racism, they are right because they have the epistemology, they have the knowledge of understanding these issues based on their experiences with racism. So the way to push that is through legal storytelling, which comes from, so critical race theory comes from critical legal studies, which came out of critical theory. It might be confusing. I'm trying to simplify
No,
it
no,
all.
it's you're doing a good job so far.
Okay. Oh, I'm very grateful. Okay. So it comes from a legal aspect, where it's really just to explain that the law, after the civil rights movement, wasn't enough. That, the equality under the law wasn't enough. They wanted to produce equality of outcome. So for that to happen, they have to say that no, the entire legal system is actually oppressive towards Black people. So they come up with this term called legal storytelling, which basically means that 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 you want to tell a story of, a narrative for black people as a way, as the basis for uh um making an argument for what they would consider justice,
Hmm.
um
That
instead of
is
using
that.
facts and reason
Mm,
and a colorblind system. You need to use a black person's lived experiences as very evidence for what
right.
they're saying being true.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's, I mean, I guess you mentioned about this equality of outcome idea, and that comes into ideologies and ideas like affirmative action and that kind of stuff. I guess it's trying to, they would see it as trying to level the playing field or right the
Yes,
wrongs of the past. And
exactly,
what,
exactly.
from a devil's advocate perspective, what would be the, I guess, the optimistic end goal that someone who subscribes to this theory would think is like, where is it heading? What does an ideal society or or a perfected society look like to someone that's trying to advance this theory or use this theory to get that way?
Yeah, I'm grateful that you use an ideal society, because it really is a pursuit of a utopia.
Mm-hmm.
And because of its Marxist roots, it does pursue a utopia, a world
Right.
essentially without injustice, a world without wrongthink,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. Nevertheless, I suppose it goes back to what I was saying earlier, in that their ideal society is equality of outcome. Um, and and in that way, many people are sincere. They really believe true
Yeah.
justice is when everybody has the same share. But of course, that's not justice. But many people have been taught to believe that when everybody has the same property,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in doing so, again, they have the Marxist thinking that who you are as a person is shaped by what you have. That's not true, of course, but many people are sincere in thinking that, well, if we can just have a world where you have equality of outcome, where everyone has the same thing, the same kind of salary, the same
Yeah.
kind of experiences for the most part, then that's justice. But of course, that's wrong. Not only is it wrong, it's impossible. It can never happen. We are not we are people with different desires, different
Mm.
skills, different um just we're just different in
Yeah.
so many
Choices.
ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, different choices. As Thomas Sowell, who's one of my heroes, says, even in the same household, two children will have different lives.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's for same household, two people.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine billions of people. It's impossible. It never happened. That's why within communism and socialist nations, they never achieve what they claim they want to achieve. Not a single one. Not China, not communist, not the Soviet Union, not Venezuela for sure, not Cuba. It never works because it's impossible. At
Mm.
the end, people love power, and if you give
Right.
people power, they will always oppress other people.
Mm.
So what we should be pursuing is equality under the law and not equality of outcome.
Yeah, and I guess it runs contrary. I would love to have a Christian socialist on the show to talk about their perspective on these issues, but to me, it runs contrary to how I see, I guess, humanity having a fallen, sinful nature. The utopia is impossible by man's means and works because there'll always be that fallen nature. People will always take advantage, like you said. People, like, the power corrupts, and people there will, any socialist and communist nation or country, state, whatever you want to call it, has
Mhm.
always ended up, I guess, as a dictatorship. And that is almost, funnily enough, the opposite of what Marx, I guess, envisioned in terms of the falling away of the state and the
Yep.
communist utopia where everyone's equal and takes, what they need and works hard. So that, to me, it is neglectful of the sinful nature of man. And I wouldn't expect a non-Christian necessarily to subscribe to that, but I think, especially as a Christian, we should be acutely aware of our fallen sinful nature because it's the very first book in the Bible, the very first chapter of the Bible. Um,
Exactly.
and yeah, so I was trying to remember where I was going to go with that, but basically, yeah, I was enlightened by Jordan Peterson's discussions of some of these topics, especially with reference to Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, where he said that basically in the Soviet Union, it got down to they were trying to split hairs almost in terms of finding the oppression. The first they came for the obvious, the wealthy, and then it became like the landowners, and then it became the business owners, the people that had more, and it kind of went further and further down, because you'll always find a demographic or you'll find somewhere in some way that you're oppressing someone else or above someone else. Exactly. So that that's where I guess I can see things like this heading in that direction, where is anyone not oppressed really when you think about it? And you may think that it's working for your benefit in some ways, but then they might call you privileged because you have different ideologies or subscribe different ways than they do.
Exactly. And that's a great point. If everyone is oppressed, which is essentially what critical race theory, I mean, they claim if you're white, you're not oppressed, but really what they really mean is if you're a white man, you're not oppressed. And even then, it's if you are a white cisgender man. And then so it at some point becomes so small, but nevertheless, it's a great point, because if everyone is oppressed, then everyone is an oppressor, right? So that's what it will naturally come down to. And it's especially important for Black people, because what's happening through, I always struggle to say this word, so I have to slow down and say it. What's happening through intersectionality, I think I nailed it.
Exactly.
What that essentially says is Black men are also oppressors against Black women, right? And Black Lives Matter has completely embraced that, which is why they are led primarily by women, which is why they are very clear in being against the nuclear family. And they actually mention that that women should be, they support primarily single parent households led by women. All right. So these ideologies are not just destructive for white people, as we were saying before, they are destructive for Black people. And as I said before, look, since fatherlessness is the biggest issue facing Black people today, so in America, for example, it's, I think 75% of Black people are raised without a father at home. That is massive. Naturally, if anyone is aware of the consequences of being fatherless, that's why you have so many disparities across the board on so many different things. It shows up in crime, in abortion, in education. It's so many things. Nevertheless, Black Lives Matter are actually okay pushing an agenda that will only make fatherlessness worse in Black communities instead of helping it. So,
well, what are the root causes of this fatherlessness that they would be exacerbating, if you know what I mean?
That's a great question too. It really comes down, there are a number of factors, but the main factor is the welfare state. That's really the main thing, because especially in America, so some would claim it was actually slavery that caused it. It's not at all slavery, not at all. If anything, slavery actually made Black families stronger after the fact. Because if you were, I'm sure as you know, if you were a man and you were a slave, in America, you didn't have a right to your family. You couldn't marry, essentially. You could have a partner, but it wasn't recognized. So when Black men and Black women finally had the right to marry, they treasured that. They treasured their family. So for decades, until I think the 1940s, you had more Black men in the home than you did white men in the home. It wasn't till, especially after the New Deal, this is FDR's New Deal after the Great Depression, and then especially through the Great Society, where LBJ was warned by, I'm forgetting his name, Moynihan. I think it's something called the Moynihan Report, where I'm forgetting his name, but this a guy who was actually, I think, in his cabinet, or at least within his own party, the Democrats, warned LBJ that the Great Society, the war on poverty, is, by increasing the welfare state, is actually going to destroy Black families, because he was already seeing that trend already. And of course, he wasn't listened to, and everything he said would happen has very much happened. So the root cause is the welfare state. Nevertheless, there are some cultural problems that exist right past that, which I suppose in many ways come from the welfare state, but but there have been, hip hop is a more recent thing. It's a very obviously young musical genre, but now hip hop itself is not wrong. Obviously, I enjoy hip hop,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of hip hop has been destructive, and it teaches people to pursue, um, you know, just sinful sexuality and gang activity and a
Mm-hmm.
number of different things, and that's been a big problem in shaping young black people's minds in not pursuing good but pursuing evil, and by doing so it just creates the problem. And especially
Mm-hmm.
so even the welfare state, so welfare states create fatherlessness. Well, then that happens if there's a cycle then, right?
Mm-hmm.
So say for me, for example, I grew up without my dad in the home. My mom was working two jobs. So then I start, I no one's taking care of me in school. I'm not doing my homework. I can honestly tell you, I probably did my homework less than 10 times throughout high school. You
Right.
might think, yeah, how did I survive? Well,
Yeah,
I didn't
exactly.
survive. I didn't graduate.
Oh, you
But
haven't turned out too badly, so you must be
well,
doing something right.
I appreciate that. It's God's grace after I became a Christian.
Mm.
That's when I started becoming, I went to college after that. But before that, I was walking aimlessly. But anyway, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Um,
Yeah, we're
yeah. So I was,
welfare state.
growing up without my father in the home. I was exposed to just a lot of the same challenges that people who are fatherless, struggle with. And now, if God had not saved me, I was on the road of repeating the same issue where I would have been, um, you know, having a child out of wedlock, and
Mm.
then the same cycle then continues, and that is a big problem. Now, unfortunately, you don't have politicians, who are addressing this issue because
Mm.
that's a difficult issue. That's not going to win you the White House. That won't win
Right.
you a seat in Congress or in Senate. What if you just talk about white people being the problem, ignoring the real issues? That will get you the votes. And that's a major problem right now in America and over here too, here in Canada as well. We have the same issue in Canada. It's not quite, the fatherless is not quite as bad as it is in America, but it's not that far off. I think it's only about 25% difference,
Mm.
which is a big difference, but yet it's, specific. I think it's roughly Black Canadians. I think it's roughly 50% of us grew up without our
Wow.
fathers in the home. But for white Canadians, it's only about maybe 20%. So you still have a 30% gap
Mm-hmm.
between the two groups. And that creates a lot of the problems that we have here too.
Yeah. So what is the welfare state doing? Is it encouraging fathers to leave their families, or is you mentioned how the welfare state's encouraging this? What is it doing to almost drive fathers away from their family? Why does it encourage that?
Great question. If you okay, so if you are a single mother, you receive, you're more likely to get into the welfare system, and
Mm-hmm.
you receive more money, and you can stay there naturally more permanently. Because I have, again, as I said before, I grew up in this kind of environment, so I know people where you had fathers or husbands who divorced their
Mm.
wives so that
Wow.
the wife could get more money. Now they were still together, but not in the
Mm.
same home
Right.
because they knew they could get more money that way. So it gets an incentive to either not get married or to stop being married so that you can receive more money.
Mm. Yeah, I've heard similar things in this country. I think my mother used to work in the kind of city center, and she said that people like she would hear young girls saying things like they would have a child in order to get a house given to them by the government and those kind of things. So it's I guess that's a similar thing
Yeah,
that's going on in our part of the world too.
yeah, 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 and yeah. Also, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because also having more kids naturally means you make more money as well from the welfare system.
Hmm.
So, and I know people too, again, who've mentioned, yeah, they want to have more kids primarily because they want to have more money.
Hmm. And in all of this, do you see any areas in which white people should be reflective of, I guess, I mean, I'm hesitant to use the word privilege, but areas in which they can look on how they conduct themselves and ways they can help to stop this or to kind of level the playing field a little bit? Or I know there's a lot of people that would say that it leads to this kind of idea that white people are repenting for sins they haven't committed, or they're trying to, they're almost using this altar, I guess, of social justice to kind of dedicate their lives to a certain pursuit. But is there a healthy way that white people can address these issues, in your opinion? And are there ways maybe that they are responsible for some things going on?
I wouldn't say that any white person today is responsible for anything unless they have individually caused, some to be victims of racism.
So you would kind of disagree with this thing of, I guess, all white people are responsible and have to hold their hands up?
Not even close. So for one, for example, just using America, because that's more dominant culture. During slavery, for example, you had only roughly in all of America 2% of white Americans own slaves. So that's 2%, which means that 98% were not. Now, many more were racist and were approving of slavery, but nevertheless, they were not themselves the ones who were owning slaves. And then, so then naturally, not their descendants are going to be also pretty minimal, compared to the entire population. And even those people should not be at all blamed for what their forefathers did, because my father, never mind my forefather, my father himself was a horrible man, and yet no one can blame me for his sins against my mom, right? So if even my own father, I should be blamed for that, then why should a white person be blamed for what some of their forefathers did? Especially when also in America, you also had roughly 25% of Black Americans in the South owned slaves. Black Americans today who descend from, so for example, Daryl from, I can't think right now, sorry, Daryl from the
just
podcast.
thinking, yeah.
He's mentioned that his forefathers, one of them owned slaves. He shouldn't be blamed for that at all, nor should he be forced to have some kind of a corporate guilt for that.
Right.
So what I would say is, yes, white people should, if they're able to, right, should do something to help out people today. However, not because they're white, but because they're human. And especially if they're Christian, they're called to help out vulnerable people, but helping them out in a biblical fashion, not in the way the culture calls us to. White guilt, I don't want anyone to have white guilt. Please. That has been destructive. White people feeling bad about themselves and then wanting to rid themselves of guilt has destroyed a number of good things for Black people. That's not good. We just, white people, Black people, everybody should want to love their neighbor, regardless of their skin color. So people shouldn't see this as a Black and white issue, literally and figuratively, right?
Yeah.
People should see it as just helping our neighbors, because it's not just Black people who are struggling, it's all people who are struggling, right? But remember, people are not struggling today because they're Black. They're struggling because of certain circumstances. So I want to be just as willing to help out a white person as I would want to help out a Black person. Now, because of my experiences, I do have naturally a passion, and it's okay for a white person to have a special kind of compassion or passion in general for a Black person. That's okay. But they shouldn't feel as if they need to do so because they are white. They should feel as if they feel like they need to, it should be because God has given them a special commission, a special desire to help out Black people. But again, but not because they are white, but because it's just their God-given duty that God has given to them.
And this idea of systemic racism, would you say that exists in some form, in your opinion?
No.
Like that system is set.
Shocking.
Yeah, like the system is set up. I guess this is the common. No, I guess you could say it's common cultural knowledge these days, in inverted commas, that systemic racism exists and the system is set up to oppress Black people. We talked a little bit, I guess, about individually guilty or feeling guilty and those kind of things, but systemically, you would say that doesn't exist then?
No, I wouldn't say so. Systemic racism is uniquely, at least as people mean it today, is uniquely a critical race theory concept, which goes back to what I was saying before, that the system is built by white men for white people. Therefore, what we think is actually equality is oppression against Black people. Well, that's wrong.
Mm.
So for example, the civil rights movement, which is why today you have a lot of critical race theorists who essentially call Martin Luther King a racist because
Wow.
his yeah in the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X Kendi. He is careful enough not to be outright in saying so, but pretty clearly implies that MLK's colorblind. Um, well, he does say that colorblind ideology is racist,
Hmm.
but he doesn't attach that to Martin Luther King Jr. But when he does talk about Martin Luther King Jr., he does imply that he is a racist. Um, but anyway, what he did is he never said abolish the system. He
Hmm.
said let's actually live up to the dream, the
Okay.
American dream. Let's live. He would reference
Hmm.
Abraham Lincoln and the founding fathers to say, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
You guys have given us a bad check. You have not
We're
lived
here to
up.
cash the check. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
Mm.
Um, so so and that's the idea there. So that's not a system. So if so, according to Martin Luther King Jr., and really just I would say, if we're being honest with looking at either it's the British system, the Canadian system, or the American system, it is not inherently racist. It's not right. The system itself isn't racist. Now there were some policies
Right.
that were racist, but as it stands today, and it's general laws. It's not racist at all. And but remember, critical race theory, it doesn't it so some today when they think of systemic racism, they might think, well, there's some laws today that are racist. I was asking, well, name one. Um, I laugh as I
Mm.
mention this, but I mentioned this in an article that I haven't not a single person today. I've been writing about this stuff for 5 years. Not a single person has been able to give me a single law that would be racist. And I say it boldly because I know they can't. And there was
Yeah.
one person who said, "Oh, well, just give me a week. I'll get it for you." Well, hold on. I thought to myself, if you have to look around for a week before you can prove me wrong, that already tells me you don't know yourself. You're just
Yeah.
hoping you just look around and
You
find it.
base your ideas on something that you don't know much about.
Exactly. Now
Yeah.
it's been more than a week. That person hasn't gone back to me. But I mentioned that to say there is no law today or policy today that's racist against Black people. But critical race theory, what it says is the entire system itself, by framing itself as being um, colorblind or as
Yeah.
being objectively, good for all
Yeah.
people, really isn't. It's basically just some
Mm.
kind of a manipulation tactic.
Yeah, and
Um,
trying to wash your hands of the responsibility of, I guess, the mess
exactly.
you've caused in the past is what they, that's
Yeah.
the kind of idea. And I think a lot of people tend to go back as well to the 3/5 rule as kind of evidence of I guess, a racist founding of America. And I think, I correct me if I'm wrong, I'm fairly certain I've heard that that was a quite a progressive law in its time for slaves, giving them a 3/5 vote. I could be wrong in that, but
Yeah.
um, it's some people have said the founding fathers were actually ahead of their time in terms of racial justice in that regard. But even still, it was repealed. It's moved on from, and the American system, I think, is uniquely designed to allow everyone, including
Yeah.
Black people, to succeed. It's I think if you start from a pure, I guess, pure foundation in terms of the American system it values everyone equally on paper, and the system
Yeah.
promotes that, people working hard and achieving the American dream, as you would say. I think that's that sort of society and those kind of objective and like I say, they're on paper. Those kind of systems, they're less in fashion these days because people feel like they're more passive, or you're
Yeah.
like saying, that's you're washing your hands of the responsibility of being anti-racist, like you mentioned before. And yeah, it's kind of troubling to me because I think it's one of the most enlightened documents, especially even into modern times. The U.S. Constitution is
Brilliant.
enlightened to me because of its guarantees of freedom and equality for all people, just by the way
Mhm.
it's written. But
Yeah.
the danger is throwing that all out for the sake of I guess feeling better. Maybe that's the motivation,
Yeah.
or I don't know if you have any perspective on that, but yeah.
So I would say the American Constitution, or even before that, the Declaration of Independence, the
Hmm.
founding documents, are okay, this may sound, I don't want to say any heretical stuff,
Right.
obviously.
Well, it's I think I know where you're about to go, and
Yeah.
I was gonna say the other day I did make the statement that it was the most divinely inspired document outside of the Bible. So try and beat that one.
But okay, so I won't say as well as you did there, but outside of the Bible and good Christian work,
Right.
it is the greatest words you will ever read. It's incredible.
Mm.
Every time I read the Declaration of Independence, I get chills. It's just incredible. And people don't realize if it wasn't for that document, the abolitionists would have failed. They would have failed. If it hadn't been for the document, the civil rights movement would have failed too. They
Mm-hmm.
all went back to, guys, let's live up to the Declaration of Independence.
Yep.
That's what it was. But yet you have people today who are trying to destroy that.
Mm.
It is incredible to
Scary.
me. It is incredible. It blows my mind.
Mm.
You know, Black Americans were once the most oppressed Black people in the world. Today, they are the most privileged Black people in the world. Why? Because of that document.
Yep.
In
They are.
Ghana, we don't have that document, right? In Canada, we don't have that document, you know?
Yeah.
So now again, Black Canadians are very, very privileged too, as are many Black, Britain. And I have a lot of friends in Britain,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, that's a scary thing to believe that the system itself. Now, look, even the founding fathers, they had mentioned many of them were really opposed to slavery. Now they still own slaves, but they recognized that it was wrong.
Mm.
Now it was still wrong for them that they didn't stop it right then and there. But the reason why they didn't do so wasn't because they didn't want to. Some of them didn't want to, but for many of them, it's because they wanted a unanimous vote. And there were many, many founding fathers who actually wanted to end slavery right at the beginning
Mm-hmm.
of, founding America. But they wanted a unanimous vote, and they didn't have that. Also, they were also afraid that they might risk a civil war right after they have, just come out of,
Yeah.
yeah,
The war of the
and
British. Yeah.
yeah. Now, with your people, but but
Exactly. We're
but
still better.
naturally, yeah, and they were right in the sense that it did lead to civil war, right? But it was what, roughly 100 years after that. If it had been, if it had been, sorry, I'm talking too fast. If there had been a civil war right then and there, it would have destroyed the country before
Right.
it started. And that's not to make any excuse by any means, but we can't ignore the historical factors that led to why they didn't end slavery
Mm-hmm.
until then. But nevertheless, they were still the youngest country to end slavery. That matters. They ended slavery even what, roughly 20, 30 years after they created the country. Jefferson ended the international slave trade. That was very significant, very, very significant. And he knew that. He knew doing so, like Wilberforce, naturally would lead to ending the slave trade period in America.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, when people say that these documents or the system itself is racist, it's not true. And even outside of all those things, biblically, racism is partiality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Racism is, being partial for one person or being against another person,
Right.
favoring one person over the other. So as Christians, when we say that we believe in systemic racism, what we're really saying is we believe in systemic partiality, which means it's on us to
Mm-hmm.
find laws that show that there's partiality. If we don't find that, we are slanderers.
Right.
If we don't find that, we are bearing false witness against a pretty important group of people to bear false witness against, which is the government.
Yeah.
We have to honor our government. So it's bad enough if I am slandering you, but if I'm slandering the government, that's two sins. I'm bearing false witness and I'm not honoring my government. So it's a
Mm.
very serious thing to be saying this. So we want to make sure that when we're saying these things, we understand what we're really meaning by them.
Yeah. And I guess to wrap up that topic, is what do you see then? I guess spiritually and even systemically, What are the issues that you see of, for example, say the church started to adopt these kind of ideas as truth, say they looked at critical race theory and thought this is something we can subscribe to, or even got behind ideologies like Black Lives Matter and said, this is something we want to move ahead with and kind of support going forward. What are the dangers in your mind with that happening in the future?
Dangerous with adopting critical race theory?
Yeah, and even getting behind like Black Lives Matter and things like that. What's the danger with the church getting mingled in with all that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we've already, been embracing that, right? Especially in America and Canada. I don't know too much about what it's like in the UK or Ireland right now, and I would love to know that.
Yeah, probably not as bad as in America, but I think it's kind of universally accepted. I guess we look at Black
Yeah.
Lives Matter, and the church would say, we stand with people crying out for racial justice. But the whole critical race theory thing, I don't think has come to a head in the UK yet, the way it has in America.
Okay. Yeah. Well, here it's destroying unity. Um, it's it's harming congregations.
Mm.
I know of people pastors who sent me emails saying that they it's harming their church because critical race theory is inherently divisive. It's supposed to divide. That's intentional. They are very, very particular about making sure that we affirm Black people's skin colors, and and they'll claim being that they want diversity or multiculturalism, but primarily it's dividing people by their skin color and wanting to elevate some people by their skin color, namely Black people, and wanting to bring down, some people, being white people, because they're too privileged, and therefore you need to be made less privileged. Um, so it goes completely against what Ephesians 2 talks about, that if you are a Christian, you are already reconciled to every single Christian. There is no more ethnic um, animosity, or there shouldn't be, because Christ has broken down the walls, the dividing walls, and
Mm-hmm.
of hostility. And so it also assumes there needs to be a reconciliation, but it doesn't need to be, because if you're a Christian, we've already been reconciled, right? um it also has a poor view of justice, where it essentially, the Bible says that we should not show partiality to the great or to the small. Critical race theory says no, you should show partiality against the rich to help the poor. That's an injustice. That's unbiblical. It also has a poor view of understanding race, right? The Bible talks about, just identity, and period. The Bible talks about how there's no man or woman, no Greek or Jew, no slave or free, I believe is how he phrases it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet critical race theory says no, there is, and you need to affirm this. It's also just, even preaching the gospel, it has a different view of the gospel, period, where it tends to, now critical race theory for sure would not affirm the gospel whatsoever. But Christians who embrace critical race theory, they add a social gospel element to their theology, where the gospel is no longer Christ died for sinners and he's sanctifying sinners, and he will glorify sinners, and he will return and create he will return to a new earth and a new heaven with perfect righteousness and perfect justice and everything else. It's no longer that. It's now Christ died for sinners, plus Christ wants to end poverty in this world. Christ wants to end racism in this world. Christ wants to um, essentially elevate Black people in this world. No, no. Now the gospel has, of course, we know that God calls us to help the poor. It does not command us to end poverty. You cannot end
Mm-hmm.
poverty in this world. You just can't. That's Christ's job. He will do that when he returns. Um, so anyway, it distorts biblical theology and biblical justice and biblical ideas about what racism is, and our identity in Christ. It makes, instead of encouraging us to pursue and understand a shared identity in Christ, it divides us into pursuing identity in our skin colors and in our gender and in our in our salaries and in our just
Mm.
ethnicity and all these
Yeah.
things that don't really mean anything at all.
Yeah, I think I posted one of your quotes on my page one time on Instagram, and I think I had some comments basically saying that things like critical race theory are the reason that they would support them or think they're worth supporting is because of this idea of pursuit of justice and reconciliation with your fellow man in terms of healing wounds of the past and I guess, this they believe it to be the pursuing justice. My biggest issue would be that it, which kind of justice is it? Is it a justice based on vengeance in a way, or I, you could say that it's based on making people pay for the past in some small way, and also like my biggest thing probably is that it would almost seek in a way to put white people in chains in terms of um they're almost in bondage because of this idea that they have to be sorry or they have to atone for something they didn't do, and
Yeah,
that's my biggest thing, is that it may seek to oppress. I mean, I feel it feels trivial almost to say oppression of white people when you think of the oppression of the past from black people, but I wouldn't want going forward for one evil to be cancelled out by another evil, for white people to feel like they have to atone for a sin that they didn't commit. Because,
yeah,
even when I've seen people characterize evangelical Trump supporters as majority bigoted or majority racist. And that makes me think, is it a lack of understanding of your fellow man, or what's behind that? But we you can't make people feel guilty for something that they're not, and I guess that's what it comes down to. But I understand people seeking to pursue justice and pursue reconciliation. I think they're good in terms of healing wounds of the past. But
hmm
I guess it's a dangerous line because I just see it as it can go very wrong quickly
yeah.
because of the spiritual consequences of that kind of ideology.
Well, when you believe all white people are oppressors, then all white people need to be punished. Then
Mm-hmm.
that's what it comes down to, which is extremely dangerous, naturally. Um, and you mentioned something before that made me think of this. You know, biblical theology, we believe that our great enemy, our great oppressor, is Satan. Unfortunately, critical race theory believes that the great enemy is white people.
Mm.
You know, and there's a reason why, even though he wasn't a critical race theorist, or that they aren't critical race theorists, black nationalists like Malcolm X through the Nation of Islam, um, they called white people, and many, even James Cone, who is the father of Black liberation theology, they called white people white devils. And that's the consequence of embracing this idea
Mm.
that white people are oppressors. Um, of course, that's not true. White people can be oppressors just like black people can. In Ghana, I lived under a dictator. He wasn't white, he was black. Um, and for many black people, for example, and another example is people don't like this being addressed, but black on black crime. If you kill someone, if you murder someone, you're an oppressor.
Yeah.
Well, 95% of black people who get killed are killed by black people,
Mm.
and they are oppressors. So oppressor does not have a skin color to it. If you're an oppressor, it's because you are a sinner who is oppressing other people. But that's true for all people. It's not a skin color. But
Mm.
unfortunately, critical race theory has made white people the great oppressor, or or the great dragon of sorts, the Satan that they
Mm.
need to conquer. And because of that, there will be this idea that all non-white people are angels and all white people are demons, and that has an effect on society and within the
Mm.
church.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think this has been a great conversation, and we could go on for so much longer. I'd love to have you back on sometime, but I also want to honor your time and not go over too much. I know it's been
No
a
problem, no
long
problem.
conversation, but it's been a great one. How can people pray for you in closing going forward with your ministry? What are the biggest challenges you're facing, both with, I guess, your blog and with the work you're doing with
Yeah,
abortion, and how can people be praying for you in that?
yeah. Well, thank you. I've also enjoyed this conversation, and yeah, whenever you want to have me back, please let me know.
Yeah, welcome
Um,
anytime.
thank you. Um, just pray for wisdom, if they can. Pray for humility. Um, Pray for godliness, that I would love Christ more, love God more, love the Bible more. Um, and pray that I would remain steadfast in the Lord.
Mm.
That's, and I guess at the end, people want to support me too. Patreon,
Yeah.
they can choose to do so as well. But primarily, just pray that I would love Christ more and I would hate my sins more.
And I'll put all those links in the bio below to your websites and Patreon, all that stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me. It's been a brilliant conversation, and it's to me it's been especially good because it's I want to have these conversations that I may shy away from, and I thank you for being open and allowing me to talk about this stuff with you, because sometimes it's just the conversation that never happens because, well, both the fact that Northern Ireland there's not too many black people around. That's just the reality of it. It's a very white majority nation, but I want to seek to understand, I guess, the issues that are affecting the Americas and then the greater
Mhm.
Western society. So I
Mhm.
appreciate you allowing me to talk to you about these issues and for being so open yourself. And I
Mhm.
think our listeners will also appreciate your openness. So thanks so much for that, and thanks to everyone that's been watching this episode. If you enjoyed, leave a comment below and on our Instagram page, and subscribe if you enjoy this video. But that's all for today, and until next time, thanks so much for watching, and yeah, we'll see you for our next episode. Thanks so much.